Gentlemen, good morning and welcome to the second day of PHP conference. It seems like you really liked day one, and since we're getting very positive response, and I'd like to thank you for that. We'd also like to thank all of our lecturers who also went an extra mile and surpassed all of our expectations. Can I get an applause for all of them? Thank you. We told you that we are counting on your feedback. Thank you all for the advices and remarks we already got. More than 115 of you took the poll, so I would like to ask you, actually all of those who still haven't done it, to do it by the end of this day. Link for the poll is bit.li/phpsrb18. Also, I'm very happy to say that our application started very well, since we had more than 300 downloads. To be honest, we were concerned only about our middle track, and we were, like, frightened whether you will like it or not, but it seems that you love it. So let's check how are the things going up there in our middle track. Let me see whether my colleague Miloš is already in the spot. No? He's taking the beer. Why change?
Well, you caught me, I was just going for my fresh. Well, it looks like this. We are making planes.
Okay.
We are drinking beer.
Just don't throw the beer.
All we want right now is to see you here.
Okay, I'm gonna come up.
Okay, I'm starting to rhyme now. It's not because of the beer, it's because this is the second day of the PHP Serbia conference. And you already know, we have cold beer, we have refreshments here. You don't have to miss a thing. You can watch all the lectures from the middle track and lay back in cozy, how do you call them?
Lazy bags.
Lazy. You know why they call them lazy? Because you're getting lazy watching your lectures here, and you get a set of headphones. You can see here, this guy, he listens to me.
Ciao, ciao.
Yeah. It's like I'm not here. So we're waiting here in the middle track, and in the meantime, enjoy the grand opening of the second day.
Okay, thank you very much. See you soon. Okay, and as for beer, I don't know whether you noticed, actually, how could you know, but yesterday we had like 210 liters of beer. And we drank 20 liters of coffee, and we had 70 kilos of pastry, 50 kilos of salad, and 160 kilos of meat. Whew. Talking about numbers. Okay. Now we know what to fix and change for the next year, and one of the things will be AC. And for now, because sometimes it doesn't have just the time and the power to cool us off, so just breathe slowly and don't breathe so much. Okay. We'd like to thank our main sponsor once again, third year in a row, Performance Technologies and some advertising. Also, major thank to our gold sponsor, Practical Company. Right after gold comes silver, and there are Blackfire, Platform, Catena Media, Hello World, Mainstream, and mCloud. Our bronze sponsors are SiteGround and Content Insights. David's helped us in creating our official application, and we heard about a number of downloads, so if you haven't already, download it now. Beer sponsors, Platform and Deploy. Thank you guys. And as for the refreshments, there are Guarana and Nescafe. Friends of the conference remain Tricoder, GitHub, JetBrains, DMS, together with other media sponsors. And I would like to use this opportunity to thank them all once again. Don't forget about all the interesting activations we have for you. As Miloš mentioned, paper airplanes, and as far as I'm informed, Dusan Lukic is in the room. Dusan Lukic is in the lead, so go up there and compete in making paper airplanes. You can win a great prize. Also, don't forget that GitHub and JetBrains are there for you to give you the license if you fill in the poll. And also don't forget to evaluate our lectures. As far as the SiteGround is concerned, you can go up there and find out what it takes to win a drone. And about grading our lectures, the link is bit.li/phpsrb speakers. Okay. I think it's time to officially start the second day, so let us watch the video. You probably saw it, but we got very nice feedback, so let's see once again.
私はたくさん旅をして 新しい人たちに出会ってワクワクする都市や文化を発見するのが好き。PHP プログラマーのなほこです。仕事柄、世界中のどこでも働くことができるけど、私の拠点地はここ。私の住む都市、ベオグラード。料理は私の大好きなことの一つ。料理をすることによって、どこにいても他の伝統を学び、そして自分の伝統もシェアすることができるから。もうすぐ開催されるコンフィレンスがとっても楽しみ。Welcome to PHP Serbia Conference 2018.
It's because you already know the video. Shall we try once again? Milan or... I'm sorry for the inconvenience. No. Okay. We move on. We're going to play later. But actually, that's Nahoko, and we're very proud of our diversity. And she's one of our proofs of our diversity. Okay, so it is time for official start. And as I said yesterday, by the power invested in me, I hereby pronounce second day of PHP Serbia Conference 2018 open. So please, let's see announcement video for our first keynote speaker today. Our first lecturer in track A today is Beau Simensen. Please welcome him to the stage. Known as a man who closed track B yesterday, today he's our keynote lecturer, and let's unglue all the things and start with the first lecture. Thank you, Beau. Enjoy your time. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. This morning I'm going to talk about something that I've been pretty passionate about over the years, and it's going to be about writing framework-agnostic packages, and kind of the exciting things that have happened over the couple of years that I've been paying attention to this, some of the things that I've found important in my life that sort of go into this area. The first thing I'd like to talk about is models. Models have always been sort of difficult for me for some reason, and I blame a lot of that on domain-driven design. When I look at domain-driven design, modeling sounds like it should be this awesome thing that's just really easy to do, except for the technical bits. And that's really, really, really annoying. So what I found myself doing for quite a while is trying to find a way to make DDD and modeling really easy in PHP so that I could focus on writing my actual business logic in my models rather than trying to worry about the ORM getting in the way. But the reality is that that's really difficult, especially in PHP. Active record isn't my favorite by far. And if you're like a doctored user, you're probably like, yes. But really, doctored is just as bad, especially when you're talking about having the technical implementations leaking into your application. One of my favorite modeling styles right now is event sourcing. I think there was a workshop on event sourcing, there was a talk on event sourcing yesterday, and there's another talk today on event sourcing. So if you're curious about this, definitely make sure to go check out the talk later today on event sourcing.
I found this was really, really natural for modeling. And there were a lot of ways that made this style feel like the technical implementation wasn't leaking into the models as much. But it was still not perfect, but it seemed to be the least obtrusive way to do it. More often than not, I find myself wanting to roll my own ORM, and I think a lot of people will try that. They'll try something and not really like how it's working with some canned software package. But really, I had to learn over like 5 or 6 years that I wasn't really framework agnostic at that point. I was building my own framework, and that wasn't really going to solve my problems, at least not the ones that were my lofty framework agnostic goal. I just created my own framework. It doesn't really solve the problem. So the biggest lessons that I've learned around modeling is that it's actually really hard to try and make a framework-agnostic model, especially in PHP. The best thing that you can hope for is to make some good compromises. And this was something that I fought against for a very long time, and I think it made my life as a developer more frustrating because I didn't use the tools the way they were meant to be used. I was trying to bend them to my own will, and it doesn't always work best that way. And finally, having written probably dozens of little micro frameworks, a couple of different custom ORMs, it's not really worth it. To try and build something on your own to replace the dependency on somebody else's project isn't a really good solution. At least that's not what I've found in my experience. So moving on from models, I came from my own little isolated world into the wider PHP community right around the time Symfony 2 was getting close to release. This was just before Composer was really usable. It was being used to build Symfony at the time, but it wasn't being used widely anywhere else. And this was my first experience with bundles. And I really liked Symfony 2 for the most part, but I didn't really like the bundles. And this was my first exposure to modern PHP packages. And it was bad. I didn't like it at all. There were too many conventions in a Symfony bundle. You just had to do all of these weird things. It seemed really complicated, especially if you wanted to build your own language for configuring your bundles. And really, going back to this core idea of framework agnostic packages, if I was going to build a bundle, it was just going to be a Symfony bundle. It was going to be a Symfony package, and all this stuff around it was just really, really kind of getting in the way. So I focused less on Symfony and started to look at a project called Silex. And Silex had something similar to bundles, but they were called service providers. And service providers were pretty simple. Compared to a Symfony bundle, the Silex service provider model was just a way to start defining services within the Pimple container. So this was really cool. And one of the ideas that I had for one of my projects was to do something with Gravatar. And Gravatar, if you're not familiar with it, is a way to convert an email address to an MD5 hash that then has an image attached to it. So if you sign up for gravatar.com, you can have your image associated with your email address pretty much anywhere. But I didn't really want to write the code to do that. I figured there's probably a library that would let me accomplish that. And this was a little bit down the future. And Packages was a thing, so you could actually search packages for packages now with a good chance that you'd find something. So I found a package called Ornacar Gravatar Bundle. It was a really cool package, and it had a lot of stuff around it. And kind of going along this idea of Symfony bundles being a lot, really all I wanted was the code within Gravatar API.php. That's all I really wanted. I didn't need the bundles. I didn't need the twig extensions. I didn't need the dependency injection component. I just wanted that little bit of code. So I thought, you know what? I'm not going to deal with this. I'm going to look and see if there's something else. And really, the core of my problem with this, in addition to just having all this other stuff, was that it required Symfony Framework Bundle. And if you look at Symfony Framework Bundle, what it required was a ton of stuff. So if I had a Silex application that was this little tiny microkernel, just to use Ornacar Gravatar Bundle, I was going to end up bringing in basically most of Symfony. And most of Symfony wasn't going to be used. So I was like, yeah, let's just go look and see. And sure enough, there was actually a project on Packagist that had a Gravatar provider. It was actually a Silex provider. And I was like, wow, why didn't I see that first? It was on the second page. So I looked at it, and it looked really nice. It had just a handful of things in it. And then I opened composer.json. And it required Ornacar Gravatar Bundle. And I was thinking right then and there, I need to write a talk on this. and that talk finally is now. This just doesn't work right. And this was sort of why I started to look at these things and why do people write the packages the way they do? Why do people spend so much time building these elaborate framework-specific bundles and packages and extensions and plugins when the core functionality sitting in there could be used in other places? And it really bothered me. But it doesn't bother me as much anymore because in a lot of ways, it is a little bit of premature optimization. Probably the best thing I could have done at that time was to recommend to this person that, hey, can we take that gravatar.app our gravatar.php file out and create a new package on it. But what I decided to do was split it out into a twig package and a gravatar package and all these other things, and I ended up getting bored and tired of it, and then just copied and pasted the code because that was so much easier to do. Of course, it was compatible with the license. But really, it's this code that I'm writing going to actually have any value? Like, is it going to be valuable on its own? I think that's the question that we need to ask more often when we're writing these sorts of packages. But on the other hand, I tend to split things too far. I'll do this fine-grained thing, and suddenly it becomes really miserable to try to manage these packages. So writing them right sometimes isn't always fun. It's not always the best way to do it, because people sometimes just want to require one package and they'll get it. So yeah, if you split things too far, you also end up with problems where people start relying on these little tiny micro packages that the whole internet relies on, and then everything breaks for 3 days. So always ask yourself, I find myself asking myself more often, is it better for me to just copy and paste this little bit of code that I need than trying to split it out into its own package just for the purpose of me wanting that separate package? Might not always be the best way. So kind of going back to doctrine, talking about models, and my experience with Silex, I actually really liked this idea of using doctrine with Silex. And if you looked in the Silex documentation from a while ago, it actually specifically said it was never going to ship with a doctrine ORM extension. So we needed one, because some of us actually did want to do that, even though Silex wasn't going to ship with it. And there were probably 3 or 4 decently maintained doctrine ORM service providers for Silex at the time. But of course, since I like to rewrite everything for no apparent reason sometimes, I created one. But I had another idea in mind, and this was the reason I actually wrote it. I wanted to be able to ship the mappings without having to require any configuration changes. So in, say, like the Symfony world, if you create a bundle and you have a domain-specific package that's separate from the bundle, and say you want to ship the doctrine implementation separate from the bundle and separate from the actual domain package, there's no real easy way to figure out where those mappings are going to live. For example, if you wanted to do this manually with Symfony, you'd have to specify the directory where the mappings are going. So in this case, we have the kernel root dir, then go into vendor, acme entity, source entity. So you have to know where your vendor directory is. You have to assume that it's going to be in the kernel root directory. And this is something that your end users are going to have to manually configure yourselves. And that didn't seem right to me. It seemed like we should be able to solve this in a way that users wouldn't have to do anything. So the core problem was trying to find a way to find a path to an arbitrary file that was shipped as a vendor dependency. And I really started to figure that we might already have the tools to do this. And there was some prior art on this already using the Spring framework. So could we use PSR-0, which is already used to find things within the vendor directory just by name? Could we do something with that? So the idea with PSR-0 was that you could have a namespace and map it to a directory so that when you requested a class, it knew which directory it belonged to. And if it shipped with the vendor, it was able to resolve that for you as well. So you were able to do everything to find a class, regardless of if it was local to your package or if it was in some other vendor directory. So I started to wonder, what could we do if we started to use PSR-0 mappings and apply them to other types of files than just classes? So the idea being, we already have this working for classes. What if we had like a class path prefix, like Spring used, and specified something that looked like a class but was actually just a directory mapping to a file? So here we have a deal resources mapping.yaml. Using the PSR-0 resource idea, that would be in the source deal resources mapping.yaml. So we'd be able to find that both locally and if it had shipped with a package. So I created this PSR-0 resource locator. I don't think anybody has probably ever used it but me. But what it allowed me to do was implement it in my doctrine ORM package so that I could specify that the mappings for my entities would be in a specific name, for a specific namespace, would be located in a specific resources namespace. So when you wanted to, say, find the mapping for a deal, it would automatically, behind the scenes, create a class path to class path, and then the name of the entity / mapping / deal. And this worked with vendors too. So this meant that I could finally do what I wanted, is to have the ability to ship the configuration mappings independently, and the user wouldn't have to know anything about that. It could just find these files. So I was really excited about this idea, but I didn't really have a way to kind of share with people, and nobody really understood what I was talking about. Twitter is really hard, and my massive long Google Groups emails don't really do very good either. But around that time, PSR-4 was starting to become a thing. And the reason that people were looking for PSR-4, apparently, was mostly because of one minor little bug in PSR-0 that was sort of complicated, but also a lot of people wanted shorter paths, because apparently a lot of people will dig into the vendor directory, and it's important to them that they don't have to go super far into the directory structure, which is totally fine. The way that this changed Composer didn't really change much. It changed the 0 to the 4. What changed in the package itself, though, was the depth that you would have to go to see these things. So if you had a prefix, the prefix would just be removed from the directory structures so that you might have source/actual name of class rather than having source/namespace class. But given my ideas about how you could use these sort of things to do some really cool things with packages so that they don't have to worry about how you're consuming them, was that I realized that we could do something similar like this and say, okay, we're going to create some resources namespace. We're going to map it to a top-level resources directory instead of in source, so that when you wanted to specify a resources directory, so like say we wanted mapping.yaml, it could just live in resources/mapping.yaml. And when it's installed as a dependency, it would be in vendor resources/mapping.yaml. So this would have really been pretty cool if you subscribe to my ideas on this. So I was really excited about it, and I proposed it to PHP Fig because we were talking about a new autoloading standard that was pretty much the same thing as PSR-0. So I thought, it's hard to get PSR-0 to do these things. Maybe we could make sure that PSR-4, or the new autoloading standard, could maybe consider these things. So I sent one of my really long emails to the Fig group, and I felt like nobody cared. Like, it seemed like weeks and like not a single response. But in reality, it was like 2 days later that Bernard, I don't know how to pronounce his last name, I think it's Strusek, published a post how he'd been thinking about similar things within the Symfony community for how to reach arbitrary paths for things that ship with bundles. He was thinking more along the lines of translation files, twig files, different sort of like template things. And so he saw this idea, and so we started to talk about it and caused probably a 3-month delay in PSR-4 because it was not the right place to do it. Ultimately, nobody else in Fig really thought this was a good idea to try and do this sort of thing on top of the autoloading specification. So PSR-4 itself shipped just caring about classes, which is kind of a bummer. I'd hoped that we could maybe do a little bit more, but PSR-4 was awesome, so this is the way it is. However, there was a package that came out of this called Puli. How many people have heard of Puli? Okay, that's about a third of the people here. That's pretty nice. Puli was sort of built on these ideas and kind of expanded them a little bit. And I'm really excited about this package, but I haven't had time to really contribute to it. And that's one of the things that I've also found is that depending on the stage in life you're in, depending on what's going on, your ability to like focus on these sorts of cool ideas kind of comes and goes. And I've definitely been on a low swing lately. But it's kind of nice to see when an idea that you're working on gets picked up by somebody else and takes it in a direction that you didn't really have the ability to execute on. So I would recommend, if anybody hasn't heard of Puli, to go check it out. And anybody who can, try to see if you can contribute to it if this sort of idea is exciting to you or interesting. So another thing that I've spent a lot of time on is looking at the HTTP layer. And sitting here preparing for this talk this morning, just mentally trying to get ready, I heard a nice cover of Daft Punk's Get Lucky playing. And it's interesting because, for me, I just got a Facebook notification that it's been 5 years since I gave my first talk. And that conference was actually where Igor Wiedler proposed Stack. That was where he actually gave the first talk publicly where we got to really talk about Stack. So It's been 5 years, and it seems like it should have been way longer than that. But it was really exciting to sort of realize that there's really a lot has happened in just a couple of years. So if you're not familiar with Stack, our lofty goal was to be able to write framework-agnostic code at the HTTP layer, which really doesn't seem like a big deal, except when you think about it, all of the code that we write, or a good chunk of the code that we write that's on the server side, is all doing HTTP stuff. It's sending requests, it's returning responses. Why is it that every single framework has its own stack to do that? Why does everybody have their own implementation of the request and the response? Of course, PHP has its own things built into it, but those aren't really super usable in all cases. So we wanted to see what we could do to try and build the most minimal stack that we could to try and write framework-agnostic packages. And it turned out to be really successful. A lot of people started to use it. Not a lot of people talk about it, but it's being used in a lot of places. The one limitation, of course, was that it was limited to the Symfony ecosystem, which wasn't necessarily a big drawback in my mind because the Symfony ecosystem was huge. It included Easy Framework, it included some of Easy, it included Drupal. For a while, it included Laravel. Laravel is still using the Symfony framework, but I don't think it's using everything anymore, so that it can't actually use Stack. But at the time, it was actually covering a wide area of things. So I felt like it was actually kind of proven that this could actually be something that was usable. So I started to pay more attention when somebody proposed a HTTP client recommendation for PHP Fig. And it sounded really cool. But it took 2 years to come up with PSR-7. And what PSR-7 turned out to be was not a client, but a specification for the request and the response objects that could theoretically be used across any framework that wanted to support PSR-7. And if you look at PSR-7 in the terms of Stack, it was essentially HTTP Foundation. So it was part of the puzzle. And PSR-7 was out for like 2.5 years before we solved kind of a bigger problem that PSR-7 exposed, which was there's no standard way to write a PSR-7 middleware. There's no standard way to interact with these messages. So we'd solved the problem of the messages, but we hadn't solved the problem of collaborating or consuming or creating these. So it took 2.5 years of playing with PSR-7 and building standalone PSR-7 frameworks before we standardized on how to handle these messages. So PSR-15 is a thing now. It's actually accepted, which is awesome. So this sort of gets us to the point now where looking at how this comes into play with this whole idea of framework-agnostic applications, we now have, from what Stack would have considered HTTP Foundation, and we have what would have been HTTP kernel. So we have all of those pieces. So we're actually able to take the things that we learned from Stack, apply them to PHP as a whole, and as frameworks start to adopt PSR-7 ecosystem as something they want to support, then we can actually start writing controllers and writing middleware that will work across any framework. You want to switch from Slim to, well, not necessarily switch, but if you want to use the same controllers in a Slim application as you do a Xenda Expressive application, you can do that now. You can write an actual HTTP controller that can be used in any framework that supports PSR-7. So really, with these two PSRs, I feel like we finally realized this vision of being able to write framework-agnostic PHP HTTP handlers, which is pretty awesome. There is another problem, though, and this was actually something that was a problem all the way back with the very first discussion when we first started talking about an HTTP client with requests and responses, is that you have to be able to instantiate these objects. And it's hard to instantiate an object from a package that you aren't officially depending on. So what ends up happening is people end up tying their specific middleware, their specific HTTP handling code to one of the implementations of PSR-7, which isn't necessarily a bad deal as long as they all depend on the same versions or compatible versions of each other. But the solution to that is actually in progress right now. It's PSR-17. It's called HTTP Factories. And what this is going to allow people to do is to write code that no longer cares how to create a response, or how to create a stream, or how to create a request. You're going to be able to inject a factory that you can just consume and use it to generate these things for you. So now we're actually moving to the point where we don't even have to depend on a specific version or implementation of a PSR-7 implementation to be able to create your code. So now you can write really completely independent pieces that can be used across any framework, across any implementation of PSR-7. It's going to be really cool. Like once this becomes the norm after a couple of years, I think that this is going to be really exciting. And finally, there's a new PSR out that's being worked on right now to return back to the beginning, really, and create a client. The original idea that was presented to FIG, I don't remember how many years ago it was an HTTP client, because everybody needs to be able to make HTTP requests, or anybody that needs to be able to make HTTP requests should be able to do so easily. And at the time, there was Guzzle and there was Buzz, and now there's even more HTTP client libraries. But unless you need something very specific, sometimes you could just use whatever. You don't care if it's going to be Guzzle. You don't care if it's going to be some other implementation. You just want to be able to make an HTTP request. So that was the original idea, and now we've come full circle to the point where we have the messages laid out. We've handled actually consuming those messages, and now we're going to be focusing on creating a way to make a client so that you can deal with remote connections a little more easily within PHP. So my biggest takeaways from the years of working on this is that I have a constant battle inside me between wanting to be a purist and wanting to be a pragmatist. I don't always want to just get it done easily. I want to make sure it's done right. But sometimes I do that at great expense. And ultimately, it's not worth it. And then the other times, when I do decide I'm just going to go quickly, then I find out that I wished I had taken the time to design it better. So it keeps going back and forth, but I think that it really comes down to what you're actually writing and for what context. So if you're writing closed source software, the problem I have is I try to write it in a way that it can be consumed in any way that I don't know about. But really, who's actually going to reuse it? Am I even going to reuse this in a different context? If not, then it doesn't really matter. Too often I will create something that's really, really nice that it's only going to be used in one way. So I need to curb that a little bit. Another thing that I often hear people talk about, and the thing that I've said before, and I even made the mistake of almost saying it earlier, is that are you actually going to change frameworks? If you're writing your model code and you want to make sure that it's not strictly tied to doctrine because it might be something else later, well, if you're going to switch from doctrine to event sourcing, that's going to be a big change. You can't assume that you're going to be able to make that change without making changes to your actual models. So I feel like this is an excuse I used for a very long time to complicate life, and it's something that I've been trying very hard not to let get in the way. On the other side, there's the open source angle. Open source is a completely different story, and I think that that's when you can really start looking at trying to make framework agnostic packages. And the reason is that this is because you have a lot of potential users from many potential frameworks, and you don't always know exactly what they want to do with your code. So I think that's a case where it actually makes sense to pay more attention to these ideas than if you were trying to do something for your work project or a side project that you're just trying to do for fun. In those cases, I don't think you have to worry about it as much. So my big takeaways, hard lessons learned over the years, is that your model is always probably going to be somewhat influenced by your ORM. And you can fight that as much as you want, but I've found that it's really difficult to ever feel good about how much you've stripped the ORM out of your domain code. So if you're really into this, I wouldn't say don't do it. Don't try to make this work exactly the way you want to, but sometimes it's easier if you just accept the fact that sometimes it just needs to be the way it is, because it's really going to be difficult to try and solve that beyond what other people who have already worked on it for a long time have solved. If you want to start writing framework agnostic packages, I think that it makes sense to start simple. Don't try to split things out as much as I was talking about doing, because ultimately that just wasn't maintainable. It wasn't something that was actually really good. So a good, simple place to start is to move the business logic out of the Glue's namespace. So if you're in a Symfony application, and you're writing inside app bundle, if you're still using Symfony 3 or Symfony 2, move that code into a different namespace. Just by moving it into a different namespace will sometimes expose how much of your code is depending on the Symfony framework itself, or at least the Symfony-specific bundle namespace requirements. And you'll start seeing where your boundaries are a little better, and you'll get more comfortable knowing which things you can actually move around. If you're writing a package that is sort of like Glue, if you're writing a bundle, if you're writing an extension, think about the code that you're writing in there. If we go back to the Gravatar bundle example, that would be a good case where you could look at that and say, you know what, this core functionality doesn't need to be in a bundle. This is something that it would really make sense to put out as a package that other people could consume, that I could consume in a different way. Like if I decide to, or if I need to work on a WordPress plugin tomorrow, is it going to make sense for me to rewrite a completely new Gravatar bundle or Gravatar package for WordPress, or would it make sense to just include this little chunk of code in both places? I think that it can lead to better design if you start to approach things like this and start thinking about this code. But yeah, if you're thinking about trying to do more with framework agnostic packages, definitely consider looking at your code carefully to figure out which things actually should be split. There is a nice way to sort of split things out. If you look at like Laravel, if you look at Symfony, there's a bunch of other projects that do this as well, where they have one master repository, and then they split out the components into their own smaller sections. That's one way to really split things out so that you have like components separate from packages and things like that. You can actually create separate repositories and not even have them all in one master repository. I've seen some projects do that as well. This can be really, really nice for people consuming your code, but it can be really difficult to maintain long term. It's one of the things that I think that I wish was easier within like the PHP ecosystem, within Composer, is to be able to easily work on split out packages as a single unit. Because right now, if you make changes in one directory and it's actually being imported from GitHub, it's hard to like work on the Glue package and a standalone domain package at the same time in development mode. It's just not super easy to do right now. So only do this if it's going to bring real value. The Gravatar bundle example, that really could have been valuable, I think. But you know, it's up to you to decide each of those as to whether or not it's actually going to bring you value. I'd really try Pulley if you have the time and the resources to do that, to kind of see what that project is trying to do. I think that it has a new maintainer now. I think he's here today. So if you want to learn more about that, come find me. I'll point you in the right direction. Because I think it's going to be a really cool project, and I think it's really going to be something that kind of pushes PHP ahead. And then lastly, make sure to consider your goals. If the goals are to write framework agnostic packages just because you think that's what everybody else is doing, might not be the right way to do it. If you have code that actually provides a lot of value, I think that it makes sense to try to do these things. And experiment. I think experimentation is probably one of the things that drove me quite a bit, was to try and make all of these different ideas and see how far I could push them. And that's actually kind of nice to be able to do, to kind of see what the boundaries are. If you're actually able to get to a point where you're getting the right bits out of your experiments, then you know you're going in the right direction. For example, with event sourcing, I made an event store implementation where I really wanted to take this idea of taking the implementation out of the objects entirely. And I was actually able to get to a point where I had my code completely independent from what was consuming it. So the event store itself, I was able to write adapters to extract the information out and inject the information in so that there was really none of my business code knew anything at all about the fact that it was having an event store storing this data. And that's something that I'm not sure it was worth doing. I was happy that I was able to see that I could get to that point, but I'm not sure it was necessarily worth the time and effort that was spent trying to get there. So I think those are sort of the things that are really useful to discover on your own, is how much of this stuff is important to you to actually make it become reality. That's all I have for now. Thank you all. I hope that you've enjoyed the talk. If you'd like to talk to me more about it, about these different ideas or any of these projects that I've talked about, definitely come find me. Thank you.
Beau, I know this is the keynote, but if we have any questions for Beau? Any hands? No, everything clear. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay. Once again, yeah.